So yes, today's fireside chat is about scalability of Agri-Tech solutions for Middle East food security. The fireside chat is more of a informal discussion. So I think we'll also be doing it three ways: moderator, the panelists, and engaging the audience. So start thinking of some questions that you would like to ask these two experts that we have here. Just by a quick show of hands, just to understand who our audience are, who here is from the sort of developer or government side? And who here is from end user side, be it cafes, restaurants, logistics, with regards to Agri-Tech? And no one. And is there anyone from startups themselves? Are there any sort of budding entrepreneurs who want to know more about, how these gentlemen and how these enterprises have scaled up? Excellent. So look, we got a broad spectrum. So I think this is the fireside chat to it. But look, I'd like to thank and introduce our two panelists. Sky Kurtz, thank you very much for coming on such short notice. Sky comes from Pure Harvest. He's the CEO. Pure Harvest is a company that has developed innovative new ways for agriculture that sees yields in excess of 30 times, which I find fascinating and outstanding. We also have Ahmad Hammoud from Alesca Agricultural Technologies. Alesca is a pioneer and one of the main players in regards to vertical farming. They also have a vertical farm at Masdar City and a visitor center, and you're all welcome to come and visit it. But gentlemen, thank you for coming, and look, I'll hand it over to you. Please introduce what it is you do and how you define Agri-Tech.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you. We'll try and keep it interesting. And honestly, when you come to asking questions, ask real questions. We'll give you real answers, because scaling in this sector is not easy. And I think a lot of people like to give only the rosy, colorful ambitions of a sector, not the bloody reality at times. I'm Sky Kurtz. I'm the co-founder and CEO. Also, I have an unusual background. I used to be a technology investor. I worked in Silicon Valley for a $38 billion technology investment firm, but then became an entrepreneur. So I've been on both sides of the table. And I would say I also built a company called Vents, which was a virtual fencing company. So think of Fitbit for cows and sheep that digitizes rotational grazing. Sold that to Merck Animal Health. So I've been in both serving, cows, cattle and sheep, and of course serving people with fresh produce. Pure Harvest is a technology-enabled agribusiness. We're not a tech company in that we don't sell technology to make money. We sell produce. And we design, procure, construct, operate, market, sell. So we're vertically integrated in the entire value chain of delivering the outcome of higher quality, safer, more sustainable, and more affordable fresh produce. And typically we're competing against imports, right? The domestic seasonal lower quality production is not always available and competes at a very commodity price level. We're selling a what we call premium local product. So it's a local premium product, but then it's at a massive discount to the air freighted imports. And that's kind of where we position. We currently are in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, expanding into Singapore and also into Morocco.
Ahmed, your turn.
Thank you, Sebastian. My name is closer. Sure. My name is Ahmad Hammoud, and I'm the head of operations at Alesca Life. And Alesca Life is a technology provider. So we can operate our farms, but we'd like to look for partners such as Sky to do the operation. And we enable Sky with the technology. So we build indoor farms, we build the technology, the hardware, and the software and the automation to improve the efficiency of these farms. But also we take this technology outside to improve more traditional farms. And just a little bit of background about my journey. I was reflecting on that. I'm in the UAE over 15 years, and I started in the oil and gas industry, which is the traditional, UAE oil, basically. And then I moved to an industry where we do confectionery. So we take raw material that is processed, and then the finished goods are processed as well. After that, I worked in the dairy industry, in the dairy industry, and the raw material was milk, so it's fresh. but the produce is processed. And now it's more of a fresh produce industry. So I think the UAE is moving towards more fresh produce, and I think the awareness of the consumer is increasing towards the health benefits of eating fresh, and I think the industry is moving towards this direction.
In terms of any startups and agri-tech, are there any barriers to entry for either developers that are looking to initiate these type of schemes or for investors, startups themselves?
Maybe commenting on that first, where there's several, right? And actually, I think the barriers to entry in this sector are higher than people realize. Even whether you're developing, for example, a software solution or an analytics solution to some specific aspect of providing better information to a field farmer about how to utilize their fields or improve yields or whatever, or if you're doing something like what we would do, a full infrastructure solution, right? It's highly capital intensive. You need multiple disciplines to work together. We always like to say we're actually 6 companies, not one, and it's why it's so challenging. Where there's technology, you buy, build, or partner, or steal tech. You're an agribusiness, so agronomical science, genetics, plant science, integrated pest management, yada, yada, yada. You're a manufacturing company, just-in-time inventory. You have a very complex supply chain, but you also have the need to, you have food safety requirements in a perishable good. So the moment you harvest it, it's losing value, right? And then you're an engineering construction company. You got to take the bare earth to the built environment like EMA or Aldar. And last but not least, you're actually a lobbyist. You're spending a lot of time working with local regulators and civil defense on specifics of safety and requirements for your specific technology with an explosive gas next to laborers, next to a post-production environment. It's a very complex business. So the barriers to entry are knowledge-based, capital-based, and the last thing is the customer. Often in ag tech, your customer is, for example, it can be the farmer, or it can be the farmer is my customer, but my consumer is the cow. Or my consumer is the produce consumer from Carrefour, but the customer is Carrefour. And you got to serve both needs. So it's actually a very complex either B2B to C sale or B2C sale with a B2B intermediary. And it's challenging. So the barriers to entry are high. And I also think that's why the failure rate has been relatively high in some of these sectors, even with brilliant technologies, because they weren't resourced or didn't really understand the go-to-market challenges or the regulatory challenges they would face in innovating their solution. They focused only on the technology,
Ahmed,
which admittedly is the easier part.
What are your thoughts on that? Because I think that these are all extremely valid points that Sky raises.
Absolutely. And I think from a technology provider perspective, I think the more vertically integrated you are, the more successful you can become. So if you want to rely on a lot of different suppliers and then you just integrate technology together, I don't think the chances are very high that you're succeeding, especially if you're selling the farm as your end product, not the produce. But what we try to do is to build the whole supply chain. And a lot of it happens to be in China, but also in the UAE. We started to do assembly in the UAE. We do a lot of recycling for the containers we use. So we use shipping containers to grow the farms inside the shipping containers. And some of that is coming in the UAE.
Can these be recycled shipping containers?
It can be recycled.
From a sustainability point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it depends. Sometimes the cost of buying a new one from China, unfortunately, is cheaper than recycling. But whenever possible, we try to recycle shipping containers. So yeah, being vertically integrated and working with partners, I think is the best thing that any company can do.
That's insightful. I'd like to open it up to the audience if they've got any questions as well at this point, just based on the discussions that we've had. As we said, it's a fireside chat, so please feel free to engage.
You said that barriers of entry are too high. Is it the regulation or the limitation of the size and then the production size is the main barrier?
Good question. I would say the main barrier is indeed minimum efficient scale. So what you said about there's a certain level of both capital and then the disciplines you need. So let's imagine I handed someone a greenhouse, built it for them and everything. They still couldn't do much with it. It's like giving an airplane without an air traffic controller, a flight attendant or anything else. The agronomical science required the right genetics, the care for the crop. And of course, at that higher level of production and intensity, you have more value in the inventory on the vines, like incredibly more valuable. So if you make mistakes, the cost of mistakes can be crippling or bankrupting, right? So it really is that a challenge, and it's one of the questions that we got in this last panel, this earlier panel. Can smallhold farmers do this? How accessible is this to the smallhold farmer? Now, at this level of technology, not at all, right? And why? Because since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when did it make sense to scale down a manufacturing process to improve its efficiency? It doesn't. It's a romantic ideal. The reality is it's a manufacturing process, and you need to scale it up. And of course, there's economies of scale and scope in every piece of what you're doing, such that optimal efficiency is at a certain level of, say, 10 hectares of production capacity, which might be $40 million of capital for the build alone, let alone pre-production burn, working capital, marketing, sales, et cetera, right? And so it really makes sense to scale it up. But that doesn't mean that smallhold farmers can't adopt technologies that can move them on the spectrum. So, for example, Morocco has been adopting in fruit and veg production. They do automated drip irrigation, basic sensors on the health of the plant and soil and pest pressure, and then nets, like a stick in a net. But just that moves them away from direct pest pressure, reduces the water intensity, massive increase in yield and quality, shoulders of the seasons extended, and creates an incredible ROIC, right? So there really are grades of a technology adoption, but really anything is better than putting a seed in the ground, spraying water on it, and praying for good sunlight and no storms, right? And so anything that moves farther away from that toward technology adoption typically has gains.
Ahmed, would you be able to talk about scalability based on initial operations? For example, Masdar city is a city that's developing, and obviously that's, like the expression, Rome wasn't built in a day. All cities develop over time based on improved technology, user demand, etc. How would scalability work in terms of operations and end user?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our model is maybe slightly different. We need scalability, but it doesn't have to be all in one location. Because we grow indoor, we need a different type of investment. And because it's in containers, it can be in any form, but containers is the easiest way to move around. So it's very modular, and it's easy to expand. Now, having said that, you need more than one location to be profitable. But if you have a residential community and you can have more than one farm in different locations, you can cater to all of these, households, and in some cases inside hotels and close to restaurants. And there's one system here actually that is, the size of this table. So it can be as small as that. So this is like the smallest size farm. But if you want to be efficient, if you want to be profitable, you need a lot of these, units. You cannot have one.
I want to be clear on one thing, though. There are business models to solve, for example, what he's saying, supplying a hotel having its own farm operation and supplying its own needs can indeed be economic, because think they're displacing a distributor who took a fat margin from an importer, from a whatever. So it's not to say there's no business models that aren't that, but it's not when I've been asked even by governments, can you just scale this down so all smallhold farmers have this? The answer is absolutely not. But on the other hand, are there models that some individual farm operators can do that? Yes, and especially with what they're doing, trying to mass standardization. By standardizing these units, they're able to then reduce the cost and capital intensity of building them.
And then we have other inefficiencies that we have to solve for. So you use the sun, which is the best source of energy. We use LEDs, and a lot of our research goes into LED efficiency. So almost 30 to 40% of our cost, our operating cost, is in LED and electricity and lighting. So this is where all the development is going. And yeah, we are almost at cost parity now with the imports, and we hope to be better as the technology develops.
Sebastian, can I comment on to the developers and to Masdar City?
No, please do.
Yeah, there's a key role that development has in making this economic and sustainable long term. Fundamentally, one day when technology gets competed away and folks like us don't have the edge we have today, which won't be that far away, 10 years, but when that happens, two things drive the efficiency of these systems at scale. When you think about feeding the people at massive scale, and it's the cost of energy, the cost of capital, right? And cost of capital drives down, of course, as you prove, scale, profitability, diversification, all these things. Now, capital markets will solve that. But on the energy one, it's a big challenge, because the optimal place to farm, for example, if I were Masdar City designing a city, and if I were if we could, for example, design us in early on into the city's planning, we can, for example, 2/3 of our water consumption is not in irrigation. It's in climate systems, in cooling towers for mechanical cooling systems and for evaporative cooling for the greenhouse. That water can be treated wastewater. So if you plan us into the wastewater integrate use, we actually use barely more than rainfall, and with rainfall like the last 24 hours, less than rainfall in the UAE. And so we can actually massively reduce and extend the water requirements of farming with that planning. And then the other example is, and what we're doing now in Saudi, we can, for example, integrate with utility scale solar deployments. And in fact, we're an enabler of solar. Why? Solar has a challenge of its production curve, right, versus demand. We actually have significant demands in the day, and we can utilize excess production, store cold tanks of cold water deeply insulated in the earth, and draw on them like a battery at night. So we actually enable utility scale solar deployment by marrying other energy demand. And then it also reduces my cost structure, makes my farm more sustainable in our energy demands. So development has a key role in this.
Geothermal that you were talking about previously?
No, that's utility scale solar deployment. That's what we're doing in Saudi Arabia right now. We don't use grid power, we use solar. But
so
then
an off-the-grid solution.
Off the grid the solution. But because it's economic, right? It's far more economic. And we partnered with a large dairy company, Nadek, and together we enabled a 30 megawatt solar power installation. So Masdar could certainly help with that, right? That's something that'd be exciting.
I was speaking to some members of the audience just before this panel started, and someone mentioned agrivoltaics. Now, that's something Masdar City has looked at itself, but it seems that are you sort of hinting at that sort of solution, an agrivoltaic solution? And for anyone that doesn't know, that's essentially where you're using solar power or solar PV cells to the top, which provide shade to the plants and the produce below, and there's a symbiotic relationship.
So yes, I think that's an interesting solution, and the technologies are getting better. But we actually prefer co-locating with a large solar installation, using the solar for the energy demands of the cooling systems, and we optimize all of the use of the sunlight, because that blocked light is wasted yield. So you mentioned our yields. We're the highest yielding tomato farm on the planet, hitting over 117 kilos a meter with no artificial light. Right? It's world leading. But why? It's because we're actually using all that sunlight. So we don't want to block the light. What we want, though, is
useful for us.
Yeah,
because we don't need sunlight.
Yes.
We actually have to cool if there's a lot of sunlight.
See, that's what I love about this conversation is like you've got two very different approaches, but they're almost complementary, not competitive. So
Absolutely.
we actually just talked
We
about
were
that.
talking about that. Yeah, so we always, we say, like, is vertical farming, we get this question, is vertical farming going to replace traditional farming or greenhouse farming? And the answer we give is always like, no, it doesn't have to be. And maybe best case scenario, it's going to be 5% of the total farming in the world. And the best case scenario would be integrating these indoor farms into traditional farms. So one of the things we do is we produce saplings to be used later in greenhouses. And this is very effective because in an indoor farm where you have high capital cost and high energy cost, you don't want a plant like a tomato plant that will stay there for a year, I don't know, more than a year sometimes, and then give you tomatoes. But it can be very profitable to produce saplings that have maybe a 6-week period.
So the synergies off each other that way.
When that's the babies and teenagers you grow in the vertical farm, you move them into in their adult life into prime time.
And give them a bit of extra space.
Yes.
I'd like to, again, turn it over to the audience if there's any questions. Yes.
Ahmad, I so agree with your comment about the complementary nature. We grow plant protein on non-arable land, and we are a soy replacement, but doesn't mean we're going to be the soy replacement, but we are and there's many other solutions like ours that are exactly the same. That wasn't my question, though. I was going to say Agri-Tech is obviously based on food production, and food production is very tricky to fund. And it is the spot that nobody really wants to touch, but it is the most critical part of the food chain. And we're involved in the whole chain, from food production through to the technology to create, the foodstuffs off of plant protein. What's interesting for us is to see this Agri-Tech solution that we have in this part of the world and understand the funding and how you see, not just how you funded your own companies, but how you generally see these Agri-Tech solutions being embraced here. Because what one sees, I think, is a pace that is not fast enough. So without being too critical, realistically, without any sugar coating, how do you see it?
Well, let me comment on this. One, my background, I used to be in capitals, and it's probably the only way I helped this company to survive, because I worked in private equity and venture capital before I became an entrepreneur. So capital's been hard, and we've raised $287 million over multiple financing rounds. We're the second most funded startup ever in the region through sheer force of will. It wasn't easy. And to your point on this, when studying an industry, right, you can look at value creation versus value capture. Right, so that if you take raw material to finished good consumed and sum up all of it, ultimately there's a value of that industry. Who's creating and capturing value? And in this region, that equation's messed up. For example, there's these powerful retailers that are monopsonistic, right? They're a few key retailers that have incredible market power. And as a result, the suppliers to them are highly fragmented. And of course, that supplier power dynamic is not helpful. On the other hand, you have a huge government involvement in the market in every element, and that's a challenge. So to your point, it's not an easy solution until some of us break out and prove that there's value that can be captured in the production side of the equation. Now, like you, we're vertically integrated, design, procurement, construction, with technology to end consumer, and the only way we've been able to survive is by doing that, right? Because we've been able to ensure that we capture the value, eliminate intermediaries. That disintermediation lets us capture more value. But now to get to financing, the right financing long-term is this is infrastructure. It needs to be financed like data centers and real estate and et cetera, right? It should be long. Ideally, we'd have an equity line of credit and draw down on it as we fund a project, and then a yield to that capital and eventually possibly some exit return. The problem is it's deemed as too risky and too early stage, so you have to go to early stage investors, venture capital firms, angel investors who want incredibly high growth expectations and returns that are not sustainable. They're achievable barely, but they're really not sustainable. So I think the challenge is there's a role for government here. And in some markets like Saudi, it's being filled. Like Ag Development Fund by Saudi Arabia is funding huge ag in, I think, 14 billion riyals last year in fisheries, fruit and veg production, etc. The Industrial Bank of Kuwait and IBK, but they'll only fund Kuwaitis, but they do fund projects. Here, the Emirates Development Bank is now trying to fill that gap, though admittedly, I think they're still haven't deployed a lot of capital, but there's a real plan for it.
That's and so, wealth of information,
yeah.
Sky. Ahmed, in terms of your, because we're also running out of time, I'm just conscious of that because there'll be other sessions. Any comments on financing or models or the feasibility for us setting up Agri-Tech?
Well, one of the models that we adopt, especially in regions that we're new at, and in the UAE we have maybe 5 or 6 small farms, and this is quite new for us. One of the things we do is we invest in the farms, and then we have offtake agreements. So we would go to a hotel, and then we would set up the farm, and then have an offtake for 3 or 5 years. Whereas they have to buy from, basically it becomes the hotel farm.
So a partnership almost.
A partnership, right?
Yeah.
But that requires a lot of initial investment.
Unfortunately, I would have loved to have this to continue for an hour. I think we've probably only got time for one more question. So yes.
Thank you. Very simple question. When we talk about scaling for the food security, in what kind of scale now to what kind of scale you're like to in terms of acreage or hectares?
Well, we're now 280,000 square meters of production capacity, around 340,000 square meters of total built area. But square meters. So yeah, we're producing, we're one of the most meaningful fruit and veg producers in this country. By the end of next year, we'll be the second biggest in Saudi Arabia. So we've scaled in relatively short time. We were born in 2017, our first farm operational in August 2018, in a relatively short time. But it's been difficult. Where do we want to be? I think that it's irresponsible to continue to farm fruits and veg in this region in fields. It is just, the water is worth more than the food. And until we one day value as a world water and actually treat it as a scarce resource, because agribusiness is the business of mining water, right? In the end, you suck the water out, move somewhere else and suck it somewhere else. Until we sort that out, it's never going to be fully adopted to its potential. But one day when we really realize and wake up to the scarcity of water, the solutions like this will be adopted at massive scale because they must. You cannot continue to use water in this way anywhere in the world, but particularly in a market like this. But that said, we're trying to kind of build that solution ahead of that demand and, of course, grow organically.
Just want to add something on the food security front. A lot of what we do right now is leafy greens mainly. and you cannot eat all your diet in lettuce. And I think to address food security, you have to go into the things that are high in calories, so rice and wheat and others. And even when you look at food security in terms of dairy, for example, if the animal feed is coming from outside, it's better than importing dairy, but you have to produce indoor.
I'm
And I
glad
think-
you're touching on that because you were both mentioning sort of bovine or animal aspect of it, and
So-
it's often an ignored
Exactly.
aspect of
Absolutely.
agri-tech.
Yeah, and this is maybe where we should focus more, and this is where our efforts will be. How we can produce rice indoor, how we can produce wheat efficiently, because we can do these things, but it will cost a lot. And I think until we solve these problems, I think indoor farming will still have a challenge. But these are things we're working on, and fodder is definitely something that we're interested in, and we're doing a lot of research to do.
Well, one comment on that is the early markets that we're all like, if it's perishable and water intensive and perishes within 14 days, it's generally strictly dominant to produce in a controlled environment, as in economically. But if it's longer than that, it could be ground, stored, siloed, shipped, stored in nitrogen storage tanks. It's uneconomic, right? And I think that equation won't change for a while. But on fodder, we're actually producing fodder now already. We like them. We saw this opportunity. We partnered with the largest fodder supplier in the region, Al Dahra, and we've built a vertical farm for fodder doing barley sprouts. And we're able to produce at a cheaper cost than the landed cost of alfalfa. So it's actually quite an innovative new growth area for us. But we think that that's also a problem. You can't say you have dairy security when all of the cows are fed on 100% imported feed. And we're trying to solve that with the technology solution.
Look, this is a fascinating conversation, and yeah, I think we have to do this again. But I would like to ask the audience to thank the two panelists, thanks Sky and Ahmed, for their time, their generosity.